On the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast, we discuss the top 30 running back rankings. Dare we say we will discuss must-have running backs, talk a little bit about some bust, or we're going to talk about players who are currently going outside the top 30 that probably should be going inside the top 30. All this and more on the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast starting right now. At this point, if you think rankings, you think Ben Wasley, okay? Ben Wasley, go follow him on Twitter at Fantasy First Down. What's going on, man?
Yeah, good, Mag. Happy to be here.
Always, man. Always a nice Friday for me. It's Saturday morning for you, Friday for me. Like, that's the best part about Friday. It's weekend podcast. We're in good moods. Like, every time I see you now, I associate you with the weekend, which is just amazing. So,
what am I playing? I didn't tell you this, but that's what I'm playing this whole time.
I do a podcast on Monday, miserable as shit. I feel bad for Sky.
Yeah,
I know. Awful stuff. And the best part is today we get to talk about the best topic in fantasy football. It's the running back rankings. We're going to break out some, must-have guys that we have higher than consensus. Other players we're fading just a little bit. Dare we say bust? Before we dive into your tiers today, which you can find on razzball.com, what's your biggest takeaway from this process? Any players surprise you that you were higher on or lower on? Talk to us a little bit.
I was surprised how much there seemed to be really clear tiers this year. Like, sometimes it's just like there's a big continuum of there's this guy, then this guy, then this guy, then this guy, this guy. I was really able to group them a little bit more easily. I just finished my wide receiver article recently. It was real different where I was like, I've no idea where these tier breaks should really be. With the running backs, it's kind of like there's this type of guy, then there's this type of guy, then there's this type of guy. They kind of broke down really nicely. I think you'll see that with the tiers, that you get different styles of player in each tier, and they just naturally rank that way based on what they're likely to be able to do and how much upside they have.
All right, let's get into. Sorry, I was muted. Of course.
Why not?
I know what is happening right now. I'm doing it for sign language. We got it going. All right. Anyway, so tier one, the all-purpose weapons, and of course, when you think top tier running backs, you want the 3-down guys, the every down back type players, and that's kind of what's highlighted in your tier here. You have Christian McCaffrey at 1, Austin Ekeler at 2, Jonathan Taylor at 3, Saquon Barkley at 4, and Bijan Robinson at 5. Now, I think 4 of those 5 guys are consensus kind of locks, in my opinion. The one guy that kind of stood out a little bit is Jonathan Taylor, who down year last year, the RB1 2 years ago. You're sensing a bounce back. Tell us why you have him ranked at 3.
With this tier, for me, the top 2 are well above. I have CMC way above, Eckler's next, and then it's those next 3, and I really struggle with those next 3, and I kind of shift them around a little bit, and I kind of settled on this order, but I'm not certain on it, especially Bijan. He could easily move up to 3 for me. I think any of those 3 I'd happily have, but the reason I have Taylor at least in this tier is I feel like last year was a bit of an outlier season. I feel like there's a lot of touchdown regression coming. It's with Shane Steichen now. Last year, Miles Sanders, 13 touchdowns. Last year, Jonathan Taylor, 4 touchdowns. If he can even move to that level of kind of double-digit touchdowns again, he immediately moves into that running back 1 conversation. Then you look at his receptions, which were well down last year, and that's very weird because he's a good receiving back. They don't have Nyheim Hines anymore to take those receptions. He's backed up by Zach Moss, who's a terrible receiving back. So you're going to expect a lot more receptions as well, and they're worth a lot of points in fantasy. I just expect him to bounce back. Whether he can bounce back quite to that level, I don't know. But we're talking about a guy who's been a dominant running back 1 in fantasy just a season and a bit ago. So I really think that bounce back is available to him, and I'd rather shoot for that upside and have a chance of winning my league with him rather than just going for someone that's going to be that safe RB1 if I have to pick out of those options.
And honestly, ADP right now has him at 5. I actually had him at 10 to start the process, but the good thing about this is that you learn a little. You learn a little when you do a deep dive. I actually bumped him up a spot to 9 after some of the information I kind of learned out. But here's kind of what I think is the biggest difference from last year and the previous 2 years. It's the win-loss. If you look at the first season, they were 11-5. Then they were 9-8, and then they went 4-12-1. Why is that important? Well, Jonathan Taylor in his career averages 21.4 PPR points per game in wins and 14.9 in losses. So there's clearly a difference when they're winning the games, and I just don't know the first season with Shane Steichen and Anthony Richardson potentially getting a lot of starts this year. Vegas win totals have them at 6.5 wins. So what I did is I just said, you know what? Let's see let's just say 6.5. I know it can't be 6.5, but just for argument's sake, let's do the math with 14 and 21, and let's see what happens. It comes up to 17.4 PPR points per game. That would have been RB6 last year. Not too bad. However, PPR running back scoring was down last year. That would have been RB8 or worse the previous 3 seasons. So from 2018 to 2021. So I have him at 9. I think that's kind of where I feel comfortable with him, especially what we talked about earlier about how rookie quarterbacks do have an impact on running backs. And the last 5 years, none of them finished in the top 6 with a rookie quarterback. So that's why I have him at 9. But I'll admit, I actually came away with this a lot more optimistic on Jonathan Taylor than I did previously. Any final thoughts before we move on to your next tier?
Yeah, look, I agree with you. I think of the guys in that tier, he's clearly the riskiest. And realistically, I wouldn't be surprised if I do drop him down to 4. Probably not as far as 5, but we'll see how we go moving forward. But if Anthony Richardson is definitely the starter in week 1, that's the biggest concern for me, because I think there's a real chance that we see some Gardner Minshew here and there. And if we do, I really like Jonathan Taylor in that situation. It's if Anthony Richardson plays 17, 18 games, then I'm very concerned about Taylor's upside.
Yep, seems like a lot of that with all the skill position players with the Colts. All right, let's talk. Who would have thought? Gardner Minshew. We love him here, folks. We have all the confidence in the world in Gardner if he gets that nod. That tier 2 is the workhorse runners. These guys kind of have a theme here. They're more of the 2-down guys, limited passing game roles. But you have Derrick Henry at 6 at the top of this tier, Nick Chubb at 7, and then Josh Jacobs at 8. Talk to us really quickly about this tier. I know obviously they have the very big time workloads, but is there any of these guys who you think probably have the most upside?
I think there's a lot of thought process that maybe Nick Chubb can take over a lot of the receiving work this year. I don't really buy that. I think they probably just slide Jerome Ford straight into that role. I don't think that that's legitimately what's going to happen. They've brought in a lot of wide receiving help as well. So I think that that's going to kind of take a lot of that output that people are kind of projecting onto him. I really favor Derrick Henry. If he's fully healthy and if he's the Derrick Henry of old, we know what he can do. So I love his upside there, even though I know everyone's talking about Chubb.
Yeah, Derrick Henry's my RB3, but I've already talked about him a million times. Let's jump down to the next tier. I think this is where it gets kind of fun. This is the guys that I think a lot of people are excited who have probably could make the biggest jumps based on the category here, the up-and-comers. Of course, starting off the tier, Tony Pollard, the new starting running back for the Dallas Cowboys. Then you have Travis Etienne at 10, Breece Hall at 11, and Rhamondre Stevenson at 12. Now, Rhamondre, in my opinion, is someone that I'm really excited about, and I actually have him higher than you do. I have him up at 7, believe it or not. So tell us a little bit why you might be a little bit lower than ADP at 10 on Rhamondre Stevenson.
Yeah, I really battle in that 10 to 12 range here, especially comparing him to the likes of Etienne and Breece Hall. I think if they use Etienne properly, he should really be a lot higher than this, but there's a lot of talk they're not going to. And Breece Hall, there's that injury risk. But my issue with Stevenson is more about his usage. I think we're seeing with Dameon Harris out, all of a sudden he's an every down back. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. Harris wasn't taking a lot of the high value touches that we'd be expecting him to get. He might get a little bit more goal line work, but I expect him to lose a lot of the receiving work. I think that probably goes to Ty Montgomery or maybe one of their second-year players, but probably Montgomery. We didn't really get to see after Ty Montgomery was injured week 1 last year how big a role he was going to have. I expected Montgomery to be the every down receiving back in New England last year, and it didn't happen because he got immediately injured. But I think that probably happens this year. We don't know for sure. We'll have to look at what happens in training camp. But if Stevenson loses a lot of his receptions, he loses a lot of the value he already had last year. And while that'll come back a little bit in goal line touches, realistically, most of the work that Dameon Harris was doing was the low-value touches anyway. So I really don't know that we want him taking those touches. They're more just going to wear him down. So I expect his yards per carry comes down and his receiving work goes down as well. And both of those things leave me pretty concerned.
So with Stevenson, we kind of got a glimpse last year in a decent sample size in the games where either Dameon Harris did not play or he played a very limited snaps because of injury. It was 7 games last year. In the games with Harris, he only averaged 13.3 PPR points per game. Without Harris, it jumps to 18.3. His carries jump from 10.6 to 16. So we did see kind of like a more well-rounded workhorse role for him. But I also love Bill O'Brien. I think the competence Bill O'Brien's going to bring to this offense is an underrated aspect to this whole thing. And Bill O'Brien, the 17-game pace of the running backs under Bill O'Brien, the opportunity, so targets and carries, is 304. That's elite usage. That includes Lamar Miller, Arian Foster for a season. So there's a lot of running backs that got a lot of work. So I do like that a lot. Let's jump down to tier 4. Tier 4 is the former stars. Oh, man, getting emotional. Pour one out for the former RB1s, essentially. And Najee Harris, I mean, it's so quick. You went from a rookie to a former star in 2 years like that. I love it. At 13, Kenneth Walker at 14, Joe Mixon at 15, Alexander Mattison at 16, James Conner, my boy. I love that you have him in the top 20 at 17, and Aaron Jones at 18. Of this group, kind of the guys here, which one? I know obviously you have Harris at the top, Aaron Jones at the bottom, but how much of a difference do you really see these guys having this year?
Not much in a lot of these. These guys can really slide around pretty much anywhere within this tier. I think Najee's pretty clearly on top for me. And everyone else really slides around based on your scoring settings, for example. In PPR, I'd move them around a little bit. I think Alexander Madison's the interesting one because we just don't understand exactly how he's going to be used. And that news kind of came out of Cook definitely moving out kind of halfway through when I was writing this article. And the former stars doesn't really make any sense in his context. That's really for Dalvin Cook. But ultimately, I feel like they're pretty much interchangeable for the most part.
Yep. I got to tell you, I think me and you are like the leading guys on James Conner. I think it makes no sense why everybody's fading him. Drew Petzing has been a long time ties to Kevin Stefanski, from Nick Chubb to Dalvin Cook to Adrian Peterson. One thing those guys have in common, a lot of carries. And I think this season with Kyler Murray banged up, this guy is going to probably see a full workhorse role. Probably going to miss 3 to 4 games, kind of standard, but it doesn't mean you can't replace him while he's out. So enjoy the top 10 to 12 production while he's in the lineup. All right, let's jump down to tier 5. New homes or now healthy? Okay, I like it. A little excitement here. We have Miles Sanders kicking off this tier at 19, Jahmyr Gibbs at 20, J.K. Dobbins at 21, and Cam Akers at 22. I'm a big fan. I think Dobbins and Akers are both second year removed from those injuries, so I really do like the fact that you have them in the top 24, showing a little respect here. Gibbs, so we're going to talk about a player in just a little bit, his teammate, but what's your thoughts on Gibbs? Do you really think he has kind of that Alvin Kamara type upside in that role under Dan Campbell? What's your thoughts about Gibbs?
Gibbs I find really difficult. One of the articles I wrote a while back, and you can go check it out on raspball.com, is I looked at what to expect from running backs in their first year. And if you are a top 12 running back, you will finish in the top 10 in fantasy. That was kind of the outcome of it. However, none of those players have ever been drafted in that kind of range of like 10 to 15. So I don't know whether we should be thinking of him as kind of like a top 12 back or a back that was drafted outside the top 10. I feel like his situation, his usage is more of like a like 10 to 20 kind of range. And those players as a general rule finish as kind of like a running back too. I feel like he's going to be splitting a lot with David Montgomery, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I find him really difficult to place because he's massively talented. He was always going to go in the top 16 in the NFL draft. It's just a situation of how they use him. I feel like they probably use him quite a lot, but it's hard to rank him high when you've got players that are going to be getting every down work ahead of him.
Yeah, and the other thing too I want to just talk about, I know we always want to compare players, rookies to current guys, and I do it a lot. But Alvin Kamara was in one of the most unique situations ever, where he came into a team with a Hall of Fame quarterback. Jared Goff is nice. He's a good player. But Drew Brees was probably the best short area passer of our generation. On top of that, they had one receiver. That is it. So his path to those receiving 100 receptions in a season was clear from the start. Jared Goff has never had 100 targets in a season for a running back. Gurley came close a couple times, and he had a 17-game pace, which was pretty close. But Gurley was a workhorse. Montgomery's going to get probably a third or maybe even a quarter of those targets from the running back game. So I just don't see that upside, especially like you brought up. You're splitting work with a 1A, at least on the ground, David Montgomery. Me and you are literally the Spider-Man meme. 20, both of us have him at 20. ADP has him at 14. I don't expect us having a lot of Gibbs this season, but let's get into it because that's what we do around here. Segues right into the next player we're going to talk about, the one-trick ponies and the boom busters. I mean, the first one, the one-trick pony's a shot, but the second one I dig. I like a little boom bust, having a little fun, maybe some best ball action here. Dameon Pierce at 23, David Montgomery at 24, Dalvin Cook at 25, DeAndre Swift at 26, Rachaad White at 27, Isiah Pacheco at 28, Javonte at 29, and James Cook at 30. Now, if you go to the website, this tier is even longer, folks. This tier goes even further into the 30s. There's 2 more tiers after that. So go check out Ben's article. But Ben, let's get into David Montgomery. Talk to us why you actually do have him a little bit higher than what we're seeing in ADP. You actually have him really close to Jahmyr Gibbs. Why do you view him as more of like a 1B than a 2 in this offense?
It's a situation of, well, what's his role and what does that role look like? I feel like he's stepping into that Williams role of getting a lot of the goal line work. And I know Gibbs might a little bit, but he is a slightly smaller back. Montgomery is that like big booming, solid back that I think is going to get a lot of that goal line carries. And we saw with Jahmyr Williams last year, 15 goal line touchdowns. That's a lot. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen exactly with Montgomery, but last year it was Williams finishing as the running back 12 and Swift finishing as the running back 24. Who does Montgomery look like? Well, he's Williams. Montgomery is Williams and Gibbs is Swift. Now, I'm not saying it's exactly going to happen like that, and obviously Swift's had some injury issues as well, but that's the type of roles they're heading into. So I think they're a lot closer than we realize. Now, to be fair, when you have a first round back that you just drafted, you're generally going to use them a lot. But when you've got someone like David Montgomery, who's also really talented, you're going to use him as well. So I expect that they just both get used a heap, and that gives Montgomery some value. He's the guy that you can get cheaper. So take the cheaper guy.
So, okay. This is the one where I actually had to I have to ask a question about every player. I'm like, what's the thing that is can you replicate the amount of carries inside the 5 that Jahmyr Williams got? Last year, he had 33 carries inside the 5. As a team, they had 38. Okay. So this made me realize, I'm like, is that random? Is that an outlier? Well, it is an outlier. Okay. And I got some numbers here to back this up. Last season, 14 of the 17 touchdowns. Now, you said 15 early on goal line. I used PFF. I don't know where you get your sources from, but we're close. We're like within one. It's not. I might use KT or something like that. Yeah, whatever. It's all good. We're just counting on our fingers at this point. Whatever. Anyway, but 14 of his 17 touchdowns came on carries inside the 5. That's why this next stat's extremely important. Okay, as a team, I said 38. It was 39. 33 of those were from Jahmyr Williams. Okay, over the last 10 seasons, only 10 teams had at least 30 or more carries inside the 5 in a season, okay? On average, the next year, they dropped by 12, okay? So they went from 31.4 on average, those 10 teams, down to 19.3. So there's a pretty big drop-off. Only one of the 10 teams had 30 the next season. That was Minnesota Vikings. Remember when Dalvin Cook had those 2 back-to-back big touchdown seasons. So it's possible, not really likely. Now, remember, there's 32 teams in the NFL, folks. So this is like 3% have a season where they are over 30 carries inside the 5. Now, David Montgomery, historically speaking, has been slightly below average in converting carries inside the 5. His conversion rate is 35% for his career. So if you just apply David Montgomery's conversion rate to all that, he loses almost 6 touchdowns, okay? That will drop him by nearly 2 points per game. And if you actually factor in the 13.4 PPR points per game that Jahmyr Williams had last year, subtract 2 points, he would have 11.4. And guess who had 11.4 points last year? David Montgomery, RB29. How weird is that shit? I was like, this is too nice. This is too nice. But I guess the whole point of this was that when teams have these kind of outlier seasons, when it comes to how many carries inside the 5 they get, it's hard to replicate that. And I think David Montgomery is still probably a good bet for 10, 11 touchdowns. But remember, a lot of Jahmyr Williams' production came from those touchdowns. So if you just subtract 17 to 11, 11's still an elite season. You lose nearly 2 fantasy points per game, and you're now getting a RB3 on a per game basis than a mid-range RB2. So that's just something important to look out for. But the last player I want to talk about, because he's not listed on here, is Alvin Kamara. Now, I actually am hedging my bets a little bit. I moved Alvin Kamara up. It just seems like a 6-game suspension. We don't really know what it's going to be yet. I think a lot of the reasons why you don't have him in the top 30 is that potential suspension. But is there any reservations? Let's say it gets dropped to 3 games, and he's a 3-game suspension. Is Alvin Kamara going to be a top 30, top 24? Where do you view Alvin Kamara this season with Derek Carr and company after the suspension's up?
Yeah, I think one thing that we haven't mentioned in general about these rankings is one thing I really consider a lot is, well, what's the upside if someone gets injured or if something changes a little bit? And I think Kamara is in that sort of conversation. So is Montgomery. Montgomery can be a massive RB1 if Jahmyr Gibbs gets injured. That's something I forgot to mention earlier. The same thing happens with Kamara. You're like, well, what's the upside? What's the best case scenario? And the best case scenario is, yeah, he doesn't get a suspension. But if he doesn't get a suspension, well, what happens? Well, he's got Jahmyr Williams there, and we just talked about what he does. He takes all the touchdowns on the goal line, which are pretty valuable. He also has Taysom Hill, who also takes all of those touches. They just drafted a rookie, Miller. Like, there's so much going on, and that's if he doesn't get a suspension. Is he going to get those touches? Well, he wasn't very effective last year. He was the RB20, and he was the guy there. He's got that suspension over him. There's so many issues there, even if the suspension doesn't happen. And I think you have to incorporate the risk of the suspension in the cost. Now, if you take him in the mid-rounds, that's fine. You're expecting to have busts in the mid-rounds. But if you're taking him anywhere before that, into this range of guys where you really need to be starting these players in your team, these are your RB2s, maybe your flex guys. Do you really want a guy who may not be playing half the time, who may be pretty ineffective if he is, and who looked a little bit washed last season, who really isn't looking like the player he used to be? I don't want to. Maybe you do. I don't know.
So this is the other thing with Kamara. I think Derek Carr comes in, it stabilizes the offense a little bit. Derek Carr, by the way, if you look at his targeting running backs, he actually does target running backs a decent amount. Average, and the reason why I bring up John Gruden is because, number one, John Gruden runs a West Coast system similar to what they've run with Pete Carmichael with the New Orleans Saints. John Gruden even went down to New Orleans to help kind of, talk through this stuff with them and see if they could find common language. So the reason why I bring that up, the 4 seasons under John Gruden, the running backs average 127 targets per season, and then the Saints last year only 107. I think that Derek Carr will bring some more targets towards him. But the other thing about Kamara, and listen, I'm PPR. Is your rankings half? Sorry.
At the moment, they're half PPR because they're set up for the Fantasy Pros competition, but they're not far off.
Yeah, I figured that. And listen, Kamara last year, RB13 in PPR points per game, 14.8, and he only had 4 touchdowns. So even if, for example, Jamal Williams gets the goal line work and he takes all the touchdowns. I mean, he was like a borderline RB1 with 4 touchdowns last year. And listen, I think Andy Dalton's, I'm not going to shit on Andy Dalton. He's my only fellow ginger left in the NFL these days, so I'm not even going to shit on him. But I think Carr is just going to bring a level of competence to this offense with Michael Thomas, with Chris Olave. I mean, I don't even know if Michael Thomas is going to play. God, every time I feel any optimism towards Michael Thomas, he gets hurt again and he's out. So I'm just put him aside for a minute. But I just think that Kamara, I'm hedging a little bit right now because once we get the 6-game suspension, I'm bumping him where you probably have him. I'm not going to have him at the 20s, but I have him in the mid-20s right now because I have a feeling there's a lot of dragging of the feet. They're waiting for the final decision with the criminal case to come out. So I just think that we could be surprised if he gets 3 games. You're getting a legit steal here. But any final thoughts before we close out the show on your rankings, on any players? Is there another player we haven't covered? Here, the floor is yours, my friend.
Look, there's a whole lot of players who are really tough to rank, especially in those mid to late 20s. I think a lot of those guys could totally bust. There's a lot of bust possibilities in there, the likes of James Cook, the likes of Isiah Pacheco. I can imagine both of those guys really struggling and being absolutely terrible. So you've got to understand when you're drafting these guys, don't draft them as your RB1, RB2, expecting them to be playing as the RB20 something during the season. They could really struggle. There are going to be guys that come through. The most important thing to do with your running backs is make sure that your bench has upside. If a player gets injured, you want the guy that's going to take over that whole role. So make sure you're filling your bench with guys with upside. There's no point in having guys who are going to be mediocre no matter what happens, but still probably finish as the RB30 or RB40. Grab guys who can be an RB1 if someone gets injured ahead of them. That's my advice on running backs in general. Always grab the handcuff, essentially. Not because you have that player on the team, But because if the other player ahead of them gets injured, all of a sudden you've got a running back one.
Do you feel like who's the kind, like a Tyler Algier type? You think kind of like that fits the mold? Who's the guy that comes to mind for you?
I mean, it used to be Alexander Mattison. It's Alexander Mattison type of guys, but there's a whole lot of guys who are going, and I mentioned in the article a little bit, guys who can step into that role. There's no one that really jumps out massively this year. Usually there's some clear ones. I think Elijah Mitchell's an interesting one where if CMC goes down, all of a sudden he falls into that role. But there's a lot of guys who you kind of unsure who's going to be the clear backup. But he's probably one of my favorites. And Algier, as you mentioned, I think is good. Zach Moss is going to be a sneaky one where you can get him in the last round. And he probably is the lead when Taylor goes down. It's really ugly, but he's actually pretty good when you get him in the right situation. So guys like that, you can get on late, just stick him on the end of your bench and just see what happens for a week or two and just play it from there.
All right, that's all we got today, folks. This is the running back rankings. Hopefully you listened in and you thought to yourself, that guy's definitely a must-have. That guy's probably going to bust. We're going to, by the way, this is probably the only part 1 of 15 running back shows we're going to do with Ben Wasley throughout the rest of the season because it's only June, folks. So I'm pretty excited. Make sure you go check out the articles on Razzball.com. Ben's is on there. So is my top 150. If you want to compare both of them, feel free to do so. But Ben's got 8 tiers. He ranks a bunch of running backs in that article. Great article. Go check it out on Razzball.com. Ben, is there anything else you got coming up you want to promote before we close out the show?
Look, I've got all my rankings, redraft and dynasty on our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Currently working on IDP stuff as well. So if you're in IDP leagues, I'll have that out soon, but that's a real grind trying to get through that. So that's what I'm focusing on as well. And if you've got any questions, hit us up on Instagram, or you can message us on Twitter, but Instagram's the one where I'm generally at the Fantasy First Down. So feel free to check us out there. I will answer all of your questions.
Thank you, Ben. Make sure you go subscribe to Razzball Fantasy on YouTube, IG, and TikTok. And, of course, make sure you jump over to Razzball.com and check out all the great articles you need to win your fantasy leagues. Once again, I'm your host, Bobby LaMarco. I want to thank my co-host again for joining today. We are out of here, folks.